Which brings us then on to the performance outcomes. So you can see there are some quite neat examples of physiologically what is going on in terms of performance. Well, if we look at this data set here, what we've got is we've got 3 time periods. We've got T0, T1, T2. So T0 to T1, so T0 is baseline, T1 is kind of post the intervention, which is a 16-week heavy training program, and then T2 is where they've been exposed to a taper. And they've got 3 groups. They've got a group that actually did a proper taper. They've got a group who then subsequently basically just did a detrain. They just reduced the intensity of exercise. And then they've got this control group here. And what you can see is that, not surprisingly, when they look at bench press, the bench press force increases as a result of training, not significantly for the control group, but it does for our other 2 groups. But when you go into the taper is really interesting, increases significantly, both against the pre, but also, amazingly, against this post-training intervention, increases the bench press score. But then when we look at this for the detraining groups, this is the group who had the intensity reduced. Remember, we've already said that reducing intensity is not the approach to take. Look at the effect. They lose the bench press capability. So all that work they put in a 16-week period is lost over the course of a very, very short taper, quite simply because you've reduced the intensity. So it really shows us that performance is a very, 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 very subtle parameter, and it's highly affected by the appropriate taper being adopted. And we see the same here. This is using vertical jump data. So we look at the vertical jump data. Less of an effect. So both of these are showing significance against baseline, but it certainly shows us that over the course of the taper, we have not lost vertical jump capability. But the detraining group, remember that's the group who had the intensity reduced to bring down the training load. Yes, they got the training effect over the 16 weeks, but they've lost significantly, although it's not got back to baseline, they've lost some of that vertical jump capability over the course of the, in this case, detraining, or that same period of time that the other group, this group, used for a taper. So where does this all fit in? Well, if we look at this series of paragraphs, you'll find this quite useful to kind of summarize everything. And it, in essence, summarizes what those graphs are showing us. In summary, the findings of the current study suggest that the duration of training intensity undertaken during the taper will play a significant role in simulated cycling performance. You saw that in all that bench press and vertical jump data. A minimum reduction, 30% in the weekly training volume, did not enhance performance, possibly due to insufficient rest. So that's a really important point, isn't it? Remember that we showed in quite early on in this presentation, in the meta-analysis data, it was about a 41 to about a 60% reduction. And the data that I presented from my textbook in relation to the work from Luika was around about a 60 to 90% reduction. So if you just do 30%, despite, remember fundamentally, you're keeping the intensity high, so you're not giving sufficient time to recover. Did not enhance performance, possibly due to insufficient rest, while a substantial reduction in training using the present protocol was also ineffective, and it was likely related to a combination of insufficient quantity, volume, and quality interval training. It was shown that if weekly training volume remains high and is not reduced sufficiently, only a 30% reduction, T30, or is reduced too much, i.e. an 80% reduction, T80, even while maintaining a high exercise intensity, then performance will not be improved. So not only can we not afford to reduce the intensity, we can't afford to reduce the volume too much. Because remember, the only way you get the volume down is you've probably got to reduce both the duration and the frequency. And fundamentally, the frequency has to remain constant as to what it was pretty much coming into the taper. And so if we then look at this data set, it's a really nice data set. So here we've got kind of our pre-post training block. So this is kind of a training block leading up to the taper. And then the participant goes into the taper itself, and this is a 3-week taper. And what you've got, and this is a really important point because it brings us back to what we've covered in previous sessions, which is understanding that biological adaptations and therefore performance gains do not occur at the same rate. And so what they've done is they've shown you this using what is called smallest worthwhile change. It's quite of a nice little measure to kind of say whether actually what we're seeing is meaningful. So what they're showing here is we take peak force. Peak force was kind of suppressed through training because that's probably a fatigue effect. But then it starts to bounce back over the course of the taper. But its effect is actually probably only quite small. So it's probably not a meaningful effect. And in fact, they're starting to lose the improvement that the taper has brought about after 3 weeks. However, when we then look at our mean power output, you see that the mean power output, yeah, it's improved because of the training, but then actually you're getting a slight increase over the course of the taper period. And in fact, again, by about 3 weeks, it's plateauing out. So it's probably suggesting if you're fundamentally interested in something which is a mean power-based activity, that you may only need a 2-week taper in this example. And that's really reinforced then when you look at the sprint capability. Sprint capability shows that very, very rapid gain over the first week and a smaller gain over the second week, but it shows pretty much as you can see in the other two variables that when you get into kind of a 21-day taper, although the effect was large, the smallest worthwhile change was large at 14 days, it started to be negative. You're getting negative consequences when we go beyond that 14-day period. And that, again, fundamentally, this is why tapering is so complicated to do and so complicated to get right. It's about getting the balance right between reducing the overall training load and not detraining your athlete, because you're still reducing the amount of training that your athlete is doing. Even though you're keeping the intensity high, which drives adaptation, you are fundamentally reducing the amount of work that they are going to do. And this is a really good evidence to show you what happens if the taper duration goes too long. You start to get the negative consequences. And then if we kind of drill into this a little bit further, this is kind of another way of thinking about this. So here you've got the overload period, and here we've got the change. And what we've got this is in two different groups. So we've got this for our intensified training group, and we've got this for a normal and what they've looked at here is 3-kilometer run time. So it's a pretty hard study that they kind of put their participants through. But what you can see, this is our normal training group, so it's kind of a normal progressive overload. Actually, 3-kilometer time is getting progressively better. They go into the taper, and actually in the taper, it still shows an improvement. It's actually gone up by about 1.5%. That's a meaningful change in 3-kilometer run time. If you look at the intensified training group, what you see is there's certainly this kind of effect here, and this is almost certainly the accumulation of fatigue that's driven this effect. But it shows actually that they had the same taper and they ended up pretty much where they were. But the gain actually that they've got is a 7.5% swing. And so this is a really good indication of how you can take different approaches to training depending upon your athlete type, and actually should end up producing the same result. So you have to look at this quite cautiously. I may use this approach with perhaps a less experienced athlete, but this is a really good indication that I might have an athlete who's gone for a really intense period of training leading to the taper. Assuming that I've got the appropriate taper, I can still get that overall gain. The key thing to understand is they've just ended up at the same point here against kind of no change. So overall, fundamentally to where they started, there is no difference between the two groups. And then if we look at this data set, this is quite neat in terms of what we're thinking about. So we've got 3 variables. We've got mean power output, we've got peak force, and we've got 30-meter sprint time. Now in each of these represent single participants, and then the more solid line fundamentally represents the average for pre, post, and then in essence what they call at peak. So these are all taken pre to post taper. So what you can see is, firstly, 20 meter sprint time, they get better, right? They improve. You can see that peak force, it's marginal in terms of the change. The peak is perhaps the misleading variable. If you take mean power output, pretty much in agreement with what we've seen in the previous slides, mean power output seems to have a bigger gain. But what it also shows you is the variability in these outcomes. There are some athletes who are having quite significant gains. This athlete's done really well out of this, but this athlete hasn't done particularly well out of this. Their sprint time's got worse. Same with this athlete, same with this athlete. This athlete's sprint time has got way better. This athlete's got better. So it's highly variable. And that is kind of really indicative of what we've been referring to in all of these sessions, which is training does have that kind of individual-based response, almost certainly based upon the genotype and the phenotype of the athlete, but also the kind of how we all individually respond to training needs to be taken into account. And you can see that it needs to be taken into account also with the way in which we design something like a taper. And so if we then go a stage further, so again, this is going back to that work from Spilsbury, and they've got 3 groups of athletes here. So they've got middle distance athletes, long distance, so middle distance is kind of 8s and 15s, long distance will be kind of your 5,000 to 10,000, and the MAR is your marathon group. And then what they've done is they've in essence got them in series of groups. So they've got a group who did regular training. So this is kind of training completed during regular training. So what do they do? And then what do they do during the taper? So let's have a look. So the taper duration for our middle distance athletes is about 6 days. Long distance is about 6 days. And these are international athletes. 14 days for marathon. So these are quite short, perhaps shorter than one might anticipate. And this kind of conforms to what we saw with the data from Muika and Busquets' group when we showed the meta-analysis. But what were they doing in there? Well, what we can see is the training volume. Look at the training volumes. So the training volume doesn't really change. It's pretty similar. Reduction for the long distance group, massive reduction in the marathon group. So that's quite an important point. Remember, in a 6-day taper, it's pretty hard to get that reduction. 14-day taper, you can afford to have that reduction. But look at what they've done. All of these groups, they've actually increased the intervals. Remember that fundamentally, the only thing you can really change, you've got to keep the frequency high. I can't really reduce the intensity. I can reduce the duration. So the way you kind of prevent a detraining effect, particularly in well-trained athletes, is you add intervals in to prevent that detraining effect. What happens to training frequency? Well, the training frequency, if we kind of look at the data in terms of what they are reporting, then actually the training frequency is kind of reported here as percentages. So the amount of time devoted to continuous training leading in, actually this group have done quite a lot of continuous training, but they've actually added in quite a bit of interval training. This is the long distance group, again, fairly similar to what we see with the middle distance group, and fairly similar to what we see with the marathon group. What happens to training intensity? Well, notice with all of these groups, really fundamentally, the training intensity here is based upon race pace. Notice what they're doing. The taper, they're bringing that intensity up both in continuous, they're bringing it up in interval. So are this group and so are this group. So fundamentally what they're doing is, these are really experienced athletes. They're certainly not reducing intensity because we've said don't do that. But what they're doing is they're bringing the intensity up to allow them to compensate for the reduction in training volume and to in essence fundamentally bring down the duration that they are exposing themselves to training per session. So how does this all fit in then with, for example, a range of different sports? So here we've got kind of, the training period, you've got individual sports and team sports. And what we see here are these are the kind of the expected biological responses and also performance-based responses for normal training. Excuse me. Here the expected outcomes with tapering for an individual-based sport. So again, what we're expecting to see may differ based on the individual, but these are kind of in line with what we've been reporting throughout the course of this session. Changes in fractional utilization, running economy, muscle strength, muscle glycogen, enzyme activity, blood cell volume, testosterone, and endurance performance. But when we look at team sports, what we tend to think about is actually a lot of these are perhaps not necessarily relevant. So there are other variables that are relevant to us. For example, we saw jump height change. Anabolic markers, we saw the change in testosterone that are not significant. We saw a reduction in muscle damage. We saw an increased sprint performance. We didn't actually show in our data repeated sprintability, but there's almost certainly some evidence to suggest that it should get better, even if it's kind of, they're not running necessarily faster, but they've got less fatigue between sprints. So it's just worth recognizing that the taper can be applied to both individual and team sports, although it's unusual to use it in team sports, particularly when they've got a long competitive season. But if you've got, for example, a team preparing for an Olympic Games, maybe a basketball team or a netball team or something, they will taper into that games. So what they're looking for from the taper may be very different to what I see with perhaps a more individual-based athlete or individual-based sport. If we then look at this work here, this is a really old bit of data. This is from Dave Bishop's group. And this is just showing us the effects of a 10-day taper, on repeated sprint performance. And what you can see is kind of week 6 and week 8. So it's kind of comparing the end of training to the taper. And you can see actually that what is really interesting is there's no real effect on sprint 1, but actually their ability to produce work, their kind of power scores, both in peak and kind of overall power, gets better across sprint number. And that's really indicative of what we've been seeing in the previous slides, which is none of them have really been showing that there's an improvement in peak performance, peak capability. But what they've been showing is kind of averages are improving. And that fundamentally, that's almost a reflection of the ability to recover and cope with the sensations of fatigue between sprints. So this is quite interesting. This is kind of week's end of training and then end of taper. And you can see that effect. The peak power has not really changed. It has, but not massively. But you can see that the total amount of work has changed quite significantly. Don't be fooled in terms of the kind of the units that this is presenting you with.